There's a quiet truth hidden in the whispers of the past ancient cultures, often dismissed as primitive, understood the rhythms of life in ways we've lost. Picture this: communities thriving for thousands of years without depleting their resources, healers curing ailments with plants, and rituals modern science is only beginning to comprehend, and societies built on deep bonds of kinship and reciprocity. These weren't just survival strategies, they were blueprints for living in harmony with the world. Yet somewhere along the way, as we raced toward progress, we left this wisdom behind. But what if the answers to some of our most pressing challenges, climate crisis, social isolation, even our own spiritual emptiness, have been waiting for us all along, buried in the traditions of those who came before? This isn't just about nostalgia for a simpler time. It's about recognizing that these cultures cracked codes we're still struggling to decipher. Take the indigenous practice of controlled burns, used for millennia to prevent catastrophic wildfires, a technique Western firefighting once rejected, only to relearn it too late. Or consider the Maori concept of kaishiakitanga, guardianship of the land, which mirrors what ecologists now call sustainable stewardship. These aren't coincidences, they're proof that so-called primitive knowledge was often light years ahead of its time. And the most startling part, we're only scratching the surface of what's still out there, preserved in oral histories, fading rituals, and the quiet resilience of surviving traditions. So why does this matter now more than ever? Because we're living in a world out of balance, where technology connects us globally but leaves us lonelier, where we've mastered convenience but forgotten contentment. Reconnecting with this forgotten wisdom isn't about rejecting modernity, it's about finding equilibrium. Over the course of this journey, we'll uncover how indigenous astronomy predicted celestial events with startling accuracy, how shamans used sound and ceremony to heal trauma centuries before psychotherapy, and how communal storytelling wove resilience into the fabric of entire societies. This is more than history, it's a lifeline, and by the end, you'll see these ancient threads not as relics, but as guides showing us how to weave a future that honors both the earth and the human spirit. The past isn't just behind us, it's waiting to light the way forward. Long before ink touched parchment, human history lived in the breath of storytellers. Imagine sitting around a fire centuries ago, listening as an elder recounted the migration patterns of caribou or the warning signs of a coming storm, not as dry facts, but woven into tales so vivid they became unforgettable. This was the genius of oral tradition, a library without walls, where knowledge wasn't stored on shelves but etched into memory through rhythm, repetition, and emotion. The Aboriginal songlines of Australia, for instance, aren't just stories, they're navigational maps, encoding thousands of miles of terrain into melodies passed down for generations. A modern GPS might get you from point A to point B, but songlines teach you to feel the land, to recognize its pulses and seasons in a way no device ever could. What's even more astonishing is how these narratives preserved scientific truths long before laboratories confirmed them. The Maori story of Rangi and Papa, the Sky Father and Earth Mother, describes their separation creating the world, a striking parallel to modern tectonic plate theory. Or take the Inuit legend of Sedna, the sea goddess whose tangled hair traps ocean creatures, mirroring today's understanding of how kelp forests sustain marine life. These weren't mere myths, they were observational data wrapped in metaphor designed to stick. Researchers now know our brains recall information better when it's attached to narrative, something these cultures perfected millennia before the term neuroscience existed. Yet perhaps the most profound loss in abandoning oral storytelling isn't just about forgotten facts, it's the erosion of communal glue. In West Africa, griots don't just tell stories, they hold stories, serving as living archives who stitch generations together. When a griot speaks, the past isn't confined to textbooks. It breathes in the room, connecting listeners to ancestors through shared laughter, gasps, and silences. Contrast that with today's fragmented digital feeds, where information floods us but meaning often slips away. Studies show children taught through oral storytelling develop stronger empathy and listening skills, as the act itself requires presence. No screens, no multitasking, just human connection. So how do we reclaim this in an age of tweets and TikTok? It starts by recognizing that oral tradition wasn't primitive, it was advanced. It compressed volumes of data into memorable packages, prioritized community over individualism, and anchored knowledge to lived experience. Some modern educators are already reviving these methods, using storytelling to teach everything from ecology to ethics. Indigenous communities remind us that the oldest form of communication might just hold the key to solving our newest problems, not by rejecting technology, but by balancing it with the timeless power of a well-told tale. Because when a story outlasts empires, there's clearly more to it than just words around a fire. Look up at the night sky today, and you might see a few constellations, Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, maybe even spot a passing satellite. But for ancient cultures, the heavens weren't just a spectacle. They were a living library, a clock, and a compass all in one. Take the Dogon people of Mali, who, centuries before modern astronomy confirmed it, knew Sirius had an invisible companion star, Sirius B, a white dwarf so dense its existence wasn't scientifically verified until the 19th century. How their oral traditions spoke of a tiny, heavy star orbiting Sirius, a detail impossible to discern without advanced telescopes. Skeptics call it coincidence, but when multiple indigenous astronomies from the Aboriginal Australians to the Maya independently recorded celestial events with precision, it's hard to dismiss as mere luck. Then there's the Polynesian art of wayfinding, a celestial navigation system so refined it allowed voyagers to cross thousands of miles of open Pacific using nothing but the stars, ocean swells, and flight patterns of birds. They memorized star paths like highways, not as static points, but as moving guides that shifted with the seasons. A Polynesian navigator could sense land over the horizon by reading subtle changes in wave patterns, a skill modern science now recognizes as detecting refraction patterns caused by distant islands. This wasn't just observation, it was a dialogue with the environment where every ripple and breeze carried meaning. What's even more striking is how these cultures wove astronomy into daily life. The Inca, for instance, built entire cities like Machu Picchu aligned with solstices, using architecture as a celestial calendar. On the winter solstice, sunlight would pierce specific temple windows, illuminating sacred stones, a Stone Age solar observatory. Similarly, the Navajo used constellations to time crop plantings, not just by tracking seasons but by reading the sky's relationship to weather patterns. Today, we rely on satellites for GPS and weather apps, but these societies had a living, breathing connection to cosmic rhythms, one that required no batteries, just attention. Yet perhaps the most humbling lesson lies in how they viewed the cosmos. Where modern science often reduces stars to burning balls of gas, ancient cultures saw them as ancestors, teachers, or divine guides. The Lakota people's Black Elk spoke of the Milky Way as the spirit road, a path souls traveled. The Babylonians named planets after gods, weaving mythology into mathematics. This wasn't primitive superstition, it was a holistic understanding that linked the heavens to human purpose. Could this blend of precision and reverence hold answers for today? As light pollution erases the stars for a third of humanity, and space exploration becomes the domain of billionaires, we've gained reach but lost rootedness. Indigenous astronomies remind us that the sky isn't just a frontier to conquer, but a mirror reflecting back our place in a vast, interconnected web. When a Polynesian navigator looked up, they didn't just see coordinates. They saw stories, history, and a roadmap for living well. Maybe it's time we relearn how to read them. The Kayapo people of the Amazon didn't just live in the rainforest, they conversed with it. For generations, they've practiced agroforestry, cultivating hundreds of edible plants in clearings that mimic natural forest diversity. Unlike modern monocultures that exhaust the soil, their gardens thrive by working with ecological patterns, not against them. A Kayapo elder once explained that when planting a fruit tree, they'd always sow medicinal herbs at its base, not just for harvest, but because the plants talk to each other, a concept modern botany now calls symbiotic plant communication. This wasn't superstition, it was sophisticated systems thinking disguised as tradition. Half a world away, the Native American practice of controlled burns reveals a similar wisdom. European settlers initially saw these fires as wasteful, only to realize too late that they prevented catastrophic blazes by clearing dry underbrush. But the deeper insight wasn't just about fire management, it was about reciprocity. Tribes like the Yurok would thank the land after a burn, offering prayers for the new growth it would bring. They understood ecosystems as living relationships, where humans weren't overlords but participants. Today, wildfire scientists increasingly adopt these ancient techniques, proving that sustainability isn't about inventing new solutions, but reviving old ones we forgot. What unites these practices is a radical shift in perspective, nature as kin, not capital. The Maori word, wakapapa, traces all life back to a shared ancestry: rivers, mountains, and humans alike. Compare that to modern economics, which treats trees as bored feet and rivers as waste channels. Yet buried in that gap is a startling revelation. Cultures labeled primitive often had a more nuanced grasp of ecology than our hyper-technical society. Take the Hopi's dry farming methods, which coaxed crops from desert soils by reading subtle moisture signals in the wind and earth, techniques now studied by drought-stricken farmers worldwide. This brings us to medicine, where indigenous knowledge transcends mere remedy. In the Andes, Quechua healers don't just prescribe plants, they speak to them, believing each carries a spirit that must be honored before harvesting. Western science once dismissed this as folklore, until researchers found that plants like ayahuasca contain compounds targeting serotonin receptors, used today to treat depression and PTSD. But here's the twist: shamans didn't isolate these chemicals in labs. They learned them through generations of listening to the plant's effects. Their pharmacopoeia wasn't just a list of cures, it was a dialogue with the natural world. From the Siberian tundra to the African savanna, healers shared another secret: medicine wasn't just physical. The San people of the Kalahari treated illness with dance, using rhythmic movement to alter brain states, a practice now echoed in trauma therapy's use of somatic experiencing. These cultures grasped what we're relearning. Healing requires reconnection to community, to earth, to something larger than the self. As one Cherokee elder put it, the plant does half the work, the belief does the rest. In an age of antibiotic resistance and isolated lives, that might be the most urgent lesson of all. So what happens when we stop seeing these traditions as relics and start recognizing them as roadmaps? From agroforestry to psychedelic therapy, indigenous wisdom keeps resurfacing in modern science, not as coincidence, but as confirmation. The real question isn't whether their knowledge was advanced, but why we ever thought it wasn't. Perhaps the most primitive notion of all is the idea that progress means leaving the past behind. The rainforests and mountains of the world have long been nature's laboratories, where indigenous healers decoded remedies hidden in plain sight, not with microscopes, but through generations of careful observation and reverence. Take willow bark, chewed for millennia by Native American tribes to relieve pain and fever. Its active ingredient later isolated as salicin, the foundation of modern aspirin. Or turmeric, used in Ayurvedic medicine for over 4,000 years to reduce inflammation, now studied for its potent curcumin compounds. These weren't lucky guesses. They were the result of meticulous trial and error, passed down through stories and ceremonies. The Quechua people's use of cinchona tree bark for fevers, later refined into quinine, didn't just ease symptoms, it reshaped global history, enabling colonial expansion into malaria-ridden regions. Yet the healers who discovered it were rarely thanked, their contributions erased by the very systems that profited from their knowledge. This pattern repeats today as pharmaceutical companies scour indigenous territories for new discoveries, patenting plants long used by traditional healers. The rosy periwinkle of Madagascar, employed by local healers for diabetes, became the basis for vincristine, a life-saving cancer drug. The Hoodia cactus, chewed by San Bushmen to suppress hunger during long hunts, was patented by diet pill companies before legal battles returned partial rights to its original stewards. It's a painful irony. The same knowledge dismissed as folklore becomes invaluable once it's repackaged in a lab. But what if the real treasure isn't just the plants, but the philosophy behind their use? Indigenous medicine never separated the physical from the spiritual. A Shipibo healer in the Amazon might sing to a plant before harvesting it, believing its healing power grows when approached with respect. Modern studies now show that plant compounds can respond to environmental stressors, suggesting that traditional harvesting rituals, once mocked as unscientific, might actually enhance a plant's medicinal properties. Similarly, the Cherokee concept of going to water, purification through rivers, wasn't just symbolic. Recent research reveals how immersion in natural water sources can lower cortisol levels and boost immunity. These cultures understood something we're only now admitting: healing isn't transactional. You can't extract a plant's chemistry while ignoring its context. Perhaps the most radical difference lies in who heals and how. In Western medicine, a doctor prescribes. In indigenous traditions, healing was communal. The Mazatec people of Mexico didn't just consume psilocybin mushrooms alone in a clinic. They gathered in darkness, guided by a curanderous chants, weaving individual healing into collective ritual. Modern psychedelic therapy is rediscovering this truth that set and setting matter as much as the molecule. When Johns Hopkins studies how ayahuasca ceremonies reduce depression, they're confirming what shamans knew all along: healing flourishes in connection, not isolation. So what would it look like to truly integrate these worldviews? Imagine hospitals where gardens replace pharmacies, where patients learn the stories behind their medicines, where recovery includes song and storytelling as much as scalpels and pills. It's not about rejecting science, but enriching it, recognizing that the oldest healing traditions might hold the missing pieces for our fractured modern lives. After all, a culture that saved knowledge in stories, ceremonies, and relationships was never primitive. It was just preparing for a time when we'd need reminding that health isn't found in a pill bottle, but in the living web we've always been part of. Now consider the power of a healing ritual, not as superstition but as neuroscience. When Navajo sand painters create intricate artworks to restore harmony to a patient's life, they're activating the same brain pathways that art therapy uses to process trauma. The rhythmic drumming of a Mongolian shaman doesn't just summon spirits, It entrains brainwaves, guiding listeners into meditative states proven to reduce anxiety. These rituals weren't placebos, they were precision tools honed by cultures that understood the body listens to more than just chemicals. And in an era where loneliness is deadlier than obesity, their greatest lesson might be this: true medicine doesn't just heal bodies. It weaves them back into the world. The San healers of the Kalahari didn't just treat illness, they danced it into submission. For hours, sometimes days, the entire community would gather as healers circled a fire, their rhythmic stomping lifting dust into the moonlight. With each step, they entered a trance state called Kia, where they believed they could pull sickness from bodies like thorns from flesh. To Western eyes, it might look like ecstatic ceremony. But neurologists now recognize these dances as profound somatic therapy, the rhythmic movement releasing endorphins, the communal singing synchronizing heartbeats, the shared belief activating the placebo effect, not just in individuals, but across the entire group. This wasn't magic, it was medicine engineered for minds and bodies wired for connection. Half a world away, the Maori practiced rongoa, healing rituals where elders would chant karakia prayers over patients while preparing plant remedies. The words weren't decoration, they were treatment. Modern research on the language effect shows that soothing spoken words can lower cortisol levels faster than silence, while the vibrations of chanting stimulate the vagus nerve, reducing inflammation. But the real genius lay in who participated. Unlike hospitals where visitors are restricted, rongoa required family and neighbors to join, holding the patient's hands, adding their voices to the chants. Studies on post-surgical recovery now confirm what these cultures knew. Patients surrounded by communal support heal faster, with lower pain levels and fewer complications. This points to a truth we've severed in modern healthcare. Illness thrives in isolation while healing flourishes in belonging. The Dagara people of Burkina Faso take this further. When someone suffers mental distress, they don't diagnose disorders, they diagnose disconnection. A healer might prescribe a ritual where the village spends days singing the afflicted person's name, literally calling their spirit back into community. Psychiatrists are now exploring how similar approaches like Ghana's prayer camps, where schizophrenia patients live with healers and families, achieve recovery rates rivaling antipsychotics without the side effects. The key isn't rejecting science, but expanding it to include what scales and scans can't measure, the medicine of belonging. Yet perhaps the most radical healing ritual comes from the Tsimane people of Bolivia. When conflict fractures their community, they don't mediate disputes, they dance them out. For hours, opponents lock arms, moving in sync until their anger dissolves into exhaustion and laughter. Neuroscientists would recognize this as co-regulation, where shared movement literally recalibrates nervous systems. Modern therapy offices rarely have space for such physical reconciliation, focusing instead on talking through trauma. But the Tsimane remind us that sometimes healing lives not in words, but in the sweat and rhythm of bodies relearning how to trust. What all these traditions share is a refusal to compartmentalize. Where Western medicine separates the psychic from the somatic, the individual from the group, indigenous healing insists on wholeness. A Cherokee healer once told an anthropologist, "You can't cure a fever if you ignore the dream that caused it." In an era where loneliness is a public health crisis and stress fuels chronic disease, their wisdom feels less like anthropology and more like a prescription. The question isn't whether we should replace hospitals with drum circles, it's how to design systems that honor what these cultures never forgot. Healing isn't something we do to bodies. It's something we do between them. Now consider how their understanding of time turns our urgency on its head. While we chase productivity, watching clocks tick toward burnout, cultures from the Andes to the outback measured time not in hours, but in cycles, seasons, generations, the slow turn of stars. The Aboriginal concept of dream time collapses past, present, and future into a continuous now, where ancestors walk beside the living. For the Maya, time wasn't linear but spiraled, with history repeating in patterns modern mathematicians recognize as fractal cycles. This wasn't primitive clock-making, it was a profound rebellion against the tyranny of the minute hand. The Raramuri runners of Mexico embody this best. Known for racing hundreds of miles through canyons without stopping, they don't compete against time, they sync with it. Their word for running, Rarajapari, translates to moving with the soul of the world. Contrast that with our stopwatch mentality, where every second is a commodity to be spent or wasted. Chronobiologists now confirm what the Raramuri intuited. Forcing our bodies into rigid schedules disrupts natural circadian rhythms, elevating stress hormones. Meanwhile, cultures that align with environmental cues, sleeping when dark, waking with light, show near zero rates of insomnia. So what happens when we apply this to daily life? Modern experiments with time affluence, the feeling of having enough time, reveal that people who perceive time as abundant report higher happiness than those with actual financial wealth. The Aymara people of the Andes go further. Their language literally places the past ahead where you can see it and the future behind where you can't, a spatial metaphor that reduces anxiety about what's to come. It's a reminder that clocks don't just measure time, they shape how we experience it. Maybe the most advanced technology isn't a smarter watch, but an older wisdom. That time isn't something we master. It's something we move with. Industrialized societies race against the clock, but indigenous cultures danced with it, seeing time not as a straight path to some distant finish line, but as a sacred circle that always brings us home. The Hopi language doesn't even have words for past or future as we know them. Instead, events exist in a continuous present, woven together like threads in a living tapestry. Their calendar follows the phases of the moon and the turning of seasons, a rhythm that kept them attuned to the Earth's heartbeat rather than the frantic ticking of a clock. This wasn't just poetic thinking, it was practical wisdom. When you plant corn by the monsoon rains rather than a printed schedule, you're not late, you're in dialogue with the land. Contrast that with how most of us experience time today, a relentless march forward where wasting an hour scrolling feels sinful and vacations come with guilt. The Tiv people of Nigeria have no word for time at all, only events that unfold when they're meant to. Anthropologists observed that when asked how long a journey would take, a Tiv elder might reply, "We'll arrive when the walking is done." Modern neuroscience suggests this flexibility isn't laziness, it's biologically sound. Studies on time affluence, the feeling of having enough time, show that people who perceive time as abundant, even when objectively busy, experience lower stress hormones and higher life satisfaction than those chasing deadlines. The cyclical view also reshapes how we handle adversity. In Western thinking, a drought or illness is a linear crisis, a problem to solve and move past. But for the new Charnolth people of the Pacific Northwest, challenges are expected turns in the wheel. Their winter ceremonies honor the inevitability of hardship, preparing communities to face it with collective resilience. Psychologists now see the wisdom here, cultures that normalize struggle as part of life's rhythm, rather than an aberration, develop greater emotional grit. The Maori proverb, "Kamua Kamyori," walking backwards into the future, captures this perfectly. By keeping ancestral lessons close, they navigate uncertainty not with fear, but with the confidence of those who have ridden this spiral before. Perhaps the most profound difference lies in how cyclical time honors rest. The Balinese Pawukan calendar divides time into 210-day cycles where certain days are nyapi, a mandatory silence where no work or travel occurs, not as punishment but as reset. Compare that to the modern cult of hustle, where burnout is worn like a badge. Chronobiologists find that cultures aligning with natural cycles, sleeping when dark, waking with light, show near zero rates of insomnia, while night shift workers in industrialized nations suffer higher risks of heart disease and depression. The message is clear: fighting time's circle is like swimming upstream. Flowing with it might be the ultimate productivity hack. This isn't about abandoning schedules but balancing them. Some forward-thinking companies are experimenting with cyclical work models, seasonal intensity followed by restorative lulls, mirroring agrarian rhythms. Schools in Scandinavia adopt forest days, where lessons follow children's natural attention spans rather than rigid bell schedules. These aren't steps backward, they're course corrections, blending ancestral wisdom with modern needs. Because when a culture thrives for millennia without wristwatches, perhaps time was never the enemy, just our perception of it. The next time you feel the panic of not enough hours, remember, clocks measure seconds, but cycles measure life. Now consider how this shift in time perception transforms something even more fundamental: our plates. While we count calories and macronutrients, traditional cultures ate by cycles we've nearly erased: migration patterns, harvest moons, the body's seasonal need. The Hadza of Tanzania consume over 800 plant and animal species yearly. A rotating menu. Modern diets have shrunk to a dozen staples. Their gut microbiomes, studied by scientists, show diversity linked to lower rates of autoimmune disease. Meanwhile, the Okinawans' practice of hara hachai bu, eating until 80% full, wasn't just portion control. It honored the body's cyclical need for digestion and rest. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were time-tested dialogues between hunger and the Earth's turning. The Inuit thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth with a diet that would baffle modern nutritionists: whale blubber, seal meat, raw fish, almost no plants. Yet diabetes and heart disease were virtually unknown among them until processed foods arrived. Their bodies had adapted to metabolize fat as fuel, turning what we'd call unhealthy into life-sustaining medicine. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, Okinawan elders were outliving nearly every population on Earth by doing the opposite, filling their plates with purple sweet potatoes, bitter melon, and seaweed. These two extremes reveal a universal truth: ancestral diets weren't about dogma, but deep listening to what specific lands and bodies required. Take fermentation, nature's original preservative. The Kung people of the Kalahari buried mongongo nuts in the sand to sour them, enhancing both flavor and digestibility. Koreans perfected kimchi, a probiotic powerhouse that fortified gut health centuries before microbiome science existed. Even European peasants relied on sauerkraut through winters, not knowing it was packed with vitamin C to prevent scurvy, but trusting generations of observed wisdom. Compare that to today's sterile, shelf-stable meals, stripped of enzymes and microbes our ancestors knew were vital. When Hadza hunter-gatherers consume honeycomb dripping with bacteria-rich pollen, they're not just eating calories, they're feeding an entire ecosystem within their guts that modern diets have left starving. Then there's the art of using everything. Native American tribes honored kills by consuming organ meats packed with nutrients missing from muscle tissue: liver for iron, brains for omega-3s. The Maasai drank blood mixed with milk during droughts, a survival strategy that balanced electrolytes and protein when water was scarce. Nothing was wasted, even fish bones became calcium-rich broths. Contrast that with our era of boneless, skinless chicken breasts, and discarded carrot tops where convenience has severed our connection to food's full potential. Nutritionists now confirm what these cultures practiced. Nose-to-tail eating provides a spectrum of nutrients no supplement can replicate, but perhaps the most radical difference was their relationship to hunger itself. The Yakut herders of Siberia practiced intermittent fasting long before it became a trend, feasting in summer when reindeer milk flowed, then shrinking meals during lean winters. Their bodies adapted to cycles of abundance and scarcity, a flexibility modern metabolisms lose when bombarded with constant snacks. Studies on the Sami people show their traditional diet activated thrifty genes that stored fat efficiently during winter, then burned it cleanly in spring. Today, with pantries always full, those same genes contribute to obesity. Our bodies remember these ancient rhythms even when our supermarkets deny them. So what happens when we bridge this wisdom with modern lives? It's not about replicating the Inuit or Okinawan plate exactly, but rediscovering their principles. Eating locally when possible, respecting food seasons, valuing fermentation over sterilization, seeing hunger as natural ebb rather than emergency. When a Hadza child learns which berries are ripe by watching elders' hands, they're inheriting more than lunch. They're learning to read the land's subtle language. Maybe that's the real nutrition we've lost, not just vitamins, but the stories, rituals, and patience that turned eating from mere consumption into conversation with the earth. Now consider how these same cultures approached another universal human experience, raising children. In Western societies, parents agonize over sleep, training, and screen time, but the Hadza simply strap infants to their backs and carry on gathering. Anthropologists found their babies cry significantly less than American infants, soothed by constant contact and the rhythm of communal life. The Inuit practiced what they called story knifing, drawing tales in snow to teach patience and emotional regulation without scolding. These weren't lax parenting styles, they were finely tuned systems that recognized children thrive not through control, but through belonging. The Maori concept of wanau expands this further. Children aren't raised by parents alone, but by an entire web of aunts, uncles, and elders. A misbehaving child might be gently corrected by any adult present, eliminating the modern isolation of nuclear family parenting. Similarly, the Beng people of West Africa believe babies reincarnate ancestors, so they're treated with profound respect rather than seen as blank slates to be molded. These approaches produced resilient adults because they met a truth develop. Mental psychology now confirms human brains wire best in networks of secure attachment, not in isolation. Contrast that with today's hyper-scheduled childhoods, where success means outcompeting peers for college spots. The Bayoka pygmies of Congo don't force toddlers to share. They let older children model generosity until the young ones imitate it willingly. Finnish schools, inspired by indigenous pedagogies, delay formal academics until age 7, prioritizing play, and consistently outperform cram-heavy systems in global literacy rankings. The lesson isn't that modern parents are failing, but that we've forgotten a simple truth. Raising humans was never meant to be a solo mission. When a Kung mother lets her 6-year-old play with sharp tools, she's not being negligent, she's trusting centuries of child-led learning that builds competence through doing. From sleep to discipline to education, these traditions share a common thread. Children aren't projects to perfect, but people to accompany. They remind us that resilience isn't taught through flashcards or forced apologies, but cultivated in the quiet spaces where young minds mirror the rhythms of their community. Perhaps the greatest gift we could give the next generation isn't more technology or tutors, but something far simpler: the lost art of letting childhood unfold at the speed of trust. Imagine a childhood where no one ever tells you, "Don't touch," where tears are met with embraces rather than timeouts, where learning looks more like laughter than lectures. This was everyday reality for the Yukwana children of the Amazon, whose upbringing reveals a paradox: the more freedom they're given, the more responsible they become. Anthropologist Jean Liedloff lived with them for years, astonished to see toddlers playing with machetes under minimal supervision, not recklessly, but with focused caution learned through gentle guidance. Unlike Western children who often rebel against strict boundaries, Yukwana kids rarely needed them because their innate curiosity was met with trust rather than restriction. The secret lay in constant connection. Yukwana infants spent their first years in slings, pressed against caregivers' bodies during daily tasks, never set down to self-soothe. Modern attachment research now confirms what these cultures knew instinctively. Babies carried this way cry significantly less, developing secure bonds that become the foundation for later independence. Contrast that with the common Western practice of sleep training, where infants learn to stop signaling distress because no one comes a process neuroscientists now link to elevated stress hormones that may wire the brain for anxiety. The Yukwana approach produced the opposite effect. Children who felt so safe in their belonging that venturing out became natural, not traumatic. But perhaps the most striking difference was how these societies handled mistakes. Where modern parenting often relies on punishments or rewards, the Yukwana used observational learning. A child who grabbed another's toy wouldn't be scolded instead. Elders would demonstrate sharing through playful games, letting social harmony itself become the teacher. Psychologists call this intrinsic motivation, where good behavior stems from genuine understanding rather than fear of consequences. The results were undeniable. Tantrums, so common in Western playgrounds, were almost unheard of. This extended beyond family into the fabric of community. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the Baining people raised children collectively, where any adult might nurse, feed, or comfort any child, creating webs of attachment so strong that orphans were virtually non-existent. Compare that to modern neighborhoods where parents often don't know their neighbors' names, let alone trust them to help raise their kids. The Baining system wasn't just practical, it reflected a profound truth. It takes a village not just as a saying, but as a biological imperative. Studies on hunter-gatherer societies show children with multiple consistent caregivers develop stronger emotional regulation and empathy, skills now vanishing in age-segregated urban life. Conflict resolution followed the same principles. When disputes arose among Inuit children, elders didn't impose solutions. They guided with stories. A tale might describe how an angry seal scared away all the fish, helping children grasp natural consequences without shame. Modern therapists use similar narrative techniques today, recognizing that stories bypass resistance better than direct instruction. The Inuit went further. They never raised their voices at children, believing yelling shrinks a child's spirit. Instead, they modeled calmness, a practice mirrored in today's gentle parenting movements, though often without the communal support that made it sustainable for generations. What emerges from these traditions isn't just an alternative parenting manual, but a radical redefinition of childhood itself. These cultures didn't see children as incomplete adults needing correction, but as whole people unfolding at their own pace. A Hadza boy in Tanzania might spend weeks practicing hunting with tiny bows, missing every shot while adults cheer him on anyway. A Shipibo girl in Peru could spend years doodling intricate patterns before anyone calls it art, because the process mattered more than the product. In a world obsessed with early achievement, their patience seems extraordinary until you meet the adults it produces, secure, innovative, and deeply connected to their purpose. The real lesson isn't that we should abandon car seats for baby slings or replace schools with jungle adventures. It's that beneath all our modern complexities, children still thrive under the same conditions they always have: belonging before learning, trust before rules, community before curriculum. As one Inuit elder told researchers, a child who feels held by many hands doesn't struggle to stand on their own. Maybe our most advanced parenting tools aren't apps or monitors, but the ancient wisdom hiding in plain sight, that raising humans was never meant to be a solitary task, but a chorus of voices saying over and over, "I'm here." When tensions rise among the Kung people of the Kalahari, they don't call lawyers or build prisons, they form a circle. For hours, sometimes days, the entire community gathers as each person involved in a dispute speaks without interruption, their words weaving a tapestry of grievances and apologies until the last knot of resentment loosens. There are no winners or losers here, no sentences handed down from authority. Justice isn't about blame, it's about restoring the delicate balance of the group. Anthropologists recorded one remarkable case where a hunter's arrow accidentally killed another man. Instead of exile or vengeance, the community held a talking circle where the grieving family and the shaken hunter shared stories, tears, and eventually forgiveness. Years later, the two families were still close. Compare that to our courtrooms where adversaries rarely meet as humans, only as plaintiffs and defendants. This practice reveals a radical truth: conflict isn't failure, it's fertilizer. The Kung see arguments as natural growth points, opportunities to strengthen bonds through vulnerability. Their elders compare disputes to storms that water the soil. Handled well, they nourish deeper roots. Modern restorative justice programs, from New Zealand's family group conferences to some Canadian sentencing circles, are rediscovering this wisdom. In a Vancouver pilot project, youth offenders who met their victims face-to-face had 60% lower recidivism rates than those processed through traditional courts. The magic isn't in the format, but in the philosophy. Harm is relational, so healing must be too. What's most striking is who participates in Kung circles. Even children listen, absorbing how to transform anger into understanding. Elders don't dictate solutions, they guide with proverbs like, "A rope made of many fibers doesn't break." Contrast that with modern systems where justice happens behind closed doors, leaving communities out of the process. The Navajo peacemaking courts, inspired by similar traditions, require the presence of extended families and neighbors because they recognize that harm ripples outward. A stolen bicycle isn't just a crime against an individual, it frays the web of trust holding the neighborhood together. This approach flips our deepest assumptions about human nature. Western justice assumes people will exploit leniency, yet the Kung system, with no police or jails, has maintained social harmony for millennia, their secret. Shame works better than punishment. In their circles, hearing how one's actions hurt others sparks deeper remorse than any fine or jail time. Neurobiology backs this up. When we witness another's pain up close, our mirror neurons fire as if experiencing it ourselves, creating empathy no stern lecture can match. Perhaps the most humbling lesson lies in what happens after resolution. Where our courts issue rulings and move on, the Kung follow up. Months later, they might casually ask, "How does your heart feel now?" A practice therapists call post-conflict processing. Rwanda's Gacaca courts, which reconciled genocide perpetrators and survivors, adopted this principle, recognizing that true justice isn't a single event but an ongoing conversation. Now consider how these principles scale. New York's Red Hook Community Justice Center handles minor offenses with talking circles instead of trials, reducing repeat offenses by 35%. Norway's Halden prison, designed around restorative principles, has Europe's lowest reoffending rates. These aren't fringe experiments. They're proof that the oldest conflict resolution manual wasn't written in law books, but in the dust of Kalahari gathering places where every voice mattered. This brings us to art, but not as galleries or entertainment. For the Kung, the songs and dances performed after resolving conflicts aren't celebrations, they're neurological reset buttons. As the community sways together, their synchronized movements release oxytocin, the bonding hormone, while rhythmic chanting lowers cortisol levels. Scientists now know such practices literally rewire brains after trauma, yet another instance where so-called primitive rituals anticipated modern therapy. The line between justice and art blurs here because for them, beauty wasn't separate from survival, it was its heartbeat. Deep in the caves of Lascaux, 17,000 years ago, someone pressed a hand against cold stone and blew ochre pigment around it, leaving a ghostly signature. To our modern eyes, it's art. To the artists, it was likely something far more vital, a ritual, a prayer, perhaps even a teaching tool. These ancient galleries weren't museums, they were libraries of survival. The famous Hall of Bulls isn't just a display of skill, it's a detailed field guide. Certain animals are painted pregnant, others in mating positions, their placements corresponding to migration patterns modern archaeologists have since verified. Those decorative dots and lines surrounding them, recent studies suggest they may be star maps, marking celestial events tied to breeding seasons. This wasn't creativity for its own sake. It was knowledge preservation in a world without writing. Across the Pacific, the towering totem poles of the Pacific Northwest served a similar purpose. To the untrained eye, their intricate carvings of eagles and bears. But to the Tlingit and Haida peoples, each figure was a chapter in a living story. Land disputes settled through symbolic representation, lineage histories carved in cedar, even legal contracts with neighboring tribes. A single pole could prevent wars by encoding treaties in imagery all parties understood. Compare that to today's legal documents, locked behind jargon and filing cabinets. These cultures turned conflict resolution into public art, where every citizen could read the laws towering above their villages. Then there's the Navajo sand painting ephemeral masterpieces created during healing ceremonies. A medicine man might spend days arranging colored grains into precise geometric patterns, not to hang on a wall, but to place beneath a patient's body. The designs aren't arbitrary, they're neurological roadmaps. When a person sits at the center, their eyes tracing the symmetrical lines, brain scans show heightened alpha waves, the same state induced by modern biofeedback therapy for anxiety. The paintings are destroyed after use because their power lies in the making, not the preservation. In a culture where beauty served function, even impermanence had purpose. This integration of art and survival shows up in startling ways. Aboriginal dot paintings from Australia's Western Desert appear abstract until you learn their topographic maps, encoding water sources and sacred sites in patterns that outsiders couldn't decipher, an ancient security system protecting vital knowledge. The Maori facial tattoos called moko weren't just adornment, they were QR codes for the pre-digital age, telling the wearer's rank, skills, and even spiritual affiliations at a glance. In each case, aesthetics and utility were inseparable. What happens when we divorce art from this deeper role? Modern galleries often celebrate self-expression alone, framing creativity as an end rather than a means. But indigenous traditions whisper a radical alternative. That art's highest purpose isn't to decorate life, but to deepen it. When a Shipibo shaman paints intricate patterns on pottery, those same designs appear in their healing chants, a visual representation of sound waves that ethnomusicologists now recognize as fractal geometry. The separation we see between art, science, and spirituality simply didn't exist for them. perhaps this explains why engaging with functional art feels different. Making a mandala from colored rice isn't just calming. It activates the same neural pathways as meditation. Weaving a basket using traditional patterns lights up brain regions associated with linguistic processing because the hands remember what the mind forgets. These aren't hobbies, they're cognitive technologies disguised as crafts. The Bauhaus movement glimpsed this truth last century with its form follows function mantra, but indigenous cultures had mastered it millennia earlier not as philosophy, but as lived instinct. Now consider architecture without architects. The Dogon people of Mali built their cliffside villages aligned with the star Sirius centuries before telescopes revealed its companion star. Their granaries' ventilation systems maintain perfect humidity using only mud bricks and geometry. No blueprints, no engineers, just generations of trial and error encoded in stories and songs. When a Dogon elder points to a wall and says, "This curve sings when the wind blows," they're not being poetic. They're referencing acoustic principles that keep termites away, a building technique modern science is only beginning to decode. This is the genius of tradition. Its science slowed down, tested across centuries, and distilled into forms so elegant they feel like magic. From cave walls to cityscapes, these cultures remind us that beauty was never just about decoration. It was, and still can be, a dialogue with the world, where every stroke, shape, and structure carries meaning beyond itself. The real masterpiece wasn't the painting or the pole, it was the thriving community that knew how to use them. The igloo, often dismissed as a simple snow hut, is a masterpiece of engineering. Its spiral design isn't just for aesthetics. Each block leans slightly inward, creating a self-supporting dome that grows stronger under pressure, much like an eggshell. The entrance tunnel dips below the main chamber, trapping cold air while body heat raises the interior to a livable temperature without fuel. Modern architects replicating this design found it stays a consistent 60 degrees warmer inside than out, using nothing but physics. Meanwhile, the Maasai's in Kajajik collapsible homes made of branches, grass, and cow dung can be dismantled in minutes when pastoralists move herds, leaving no trace on the landscape. Their thatched roofs breathe in the equatorial heat, eliminating the need for air conditioning in climates where modern buildings bake without it. Then there's the Anasazi's 4-story cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, built into south-facing alcoves. The overhanging rock shields against summer sun while allowing winter rays to penetrate deep into the rooms, creating passive solar heating 1,000 years before the term was coined. Airflow channels carved into the stone kept interiors dry during monsoons, while white plaster walls reflected precious light into windowless chambers. Nearby, the Hohokam people dug hundreds of miles of irrigation canals without metal tools, some still in use today, proving ancient infrastructure could outlast modern concrete. But perhaps the most resilient design belongs to the Mongolian Jur. Its circular shape deflects the steppes' hurricane-force winds, while the central smoke hole creates a vacuum that pulls fresh air upward without drafts. Felt layers can be added or removed like living insulation, adapting to temperatures from -40 to over 100 degrees. Unlike RVs or trailers that guzzle fuel, Jurs harness the wind's energy to ventilate naturally. When anthropologists studied why nomadic children in Jurs get fewer respiratory infections than those in urban apartments, they discovered the constant air exchange prevents moisture buildup, a feature now copied in high-end, healthy homes. What unites these structures is their debt to observation rather than invention. The Inuit didn't calculate load-bearing formulas, they watched how snow settled after storms. The Anasazi didn't study thermal mass, they felt how rock absorbed sunlight. This distinction reveals the heart of indigenous genius. They solved problems by deepening their dialogue with the environment, not conquering it. Modern green architecture is just beginning to catch up, with earthships using tire-rammed earth walls for thermal mass and living roofs mimicking prairie insulation. The tragedy isn't that these solutions were lost, it's that we ever stopped seeing them as sophisticated. Now consider how these same cultures approached something even more complex than shelter, the invisible architecture of exchange. Where modern economies run on anonymous transactions, the Trobriand Islanders' Kula ring a ceremonial exchange of shell necklaces and armbands bound distant islands into interdependent networks. These weren't commodities but relational tokens, passing through hundreds of hands over decades. Each piece accumulated stories that strengthened social bonds. Anthropologists found islands in the Kula Ring survived tsunamis and droughts better than those outside it, because the system created webs of obligation that guaranteed mutual aid in crises. The potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest tribes took this further. Chiefs would give away fortunes, blankets, canoes, even copper shields, in rituals that seemed like reckless generosity to colonizers. But buried in the spectacle was a brilliant economic model. By redistributing wealth through gifting, they prevented hoarding and ensured no family starved during lean winters. Modern basic income experiments echo this wisdom, proving that circulation, not accumulation, creates resilient communities. Even the Kung system of H0, exchanging gifts with no immediate return, functioned as a social safety net, where the obligation to reciprocate spread resources across the group like an ancient version of risk-sharing apps. What these systems shared was an understanding that value isn't stored in objects, but in relationships. A Maori greenstone pendant gains worth not from its mineral content, but from the generations of chiefs who wore it. The Yupik of Alaska traded ivory not based on weight, but on the carver's reputation, anticipating modern branding by centuries. In a world where blockchain promises traceability, these cultures maintained ledgers not in ledgers, but in memory and mutual obligation. The lesson isn't that we should abandon currency, but that we've severed its roots. When a Trobriand necklace circulates for generations, it carries more than decorative value. It becomes a living contract. Our challenge isn't reinventing economics, but remembering what it was for, not just moving goods, but weaving people together. After all, the sturdiest structures aren't those that stand against the storm, but those that bend with it, whether they're made of snow, stone, or promises. Imagine a feast where the richest person doesn't hoard treasure, they give it all away. That's the heart of the potlatch, a ceremony practiced by Pacific Northwest tribes like the Kwakwaka'wakwa and Tlingit, where leaders competed not in accumulation, but in generosity. A chief might spend years gathering blankets, carved boxes, and even copper shields worth fortunes, only to distribute everything in a single extravagant event. To colonial observers, this seemed irrational. Why surrender hard-earned wealth? But hidden in this ritual was an economic blueprint far more sophisticated than early settlers realized. The potlatch wasn't just gift-giving. It was a living algorithm for social stability. By obligating recipients to reciprocate with even greater generosity later, the system ensured resources flowed continuously through the community like blood through a body. When one village faced a lean fishing season, the web of debts created during potlatches guaranteed others would share their surplus. Anthropologists later recognized this as a brilliant hedge against scarcity, what economists now call risk pooling. Modern insurance policies and disaster relief funds operate on similar principles, just without the dances and cedar masks. What's even more striking is how these ceremonies measured value. A copper shield's worth wasn't based on weight or rarity. but on its history how many potlatches it had circulated through and which chiefs had owned it. Sound familiar? It's not so different from today's concept of provenance, where a Van Gogh painting gains value from its exhibition record. The Tlingit took this further, using the potlatch to settle disputes without courts. If two families quarreled over fishing rights, they might resolve it by hosting competing giveaways. The more one gave, the stronger their claim. Justice wasn't decided by force, but by collective awe at someone's capacity to share. Fast forward to today, and fragments of this wisdom are resurfacing in unexpected places. Pay what you can. Cafes from North Carolina to New Zealand operate on potlatch-like trust, serving meals to those who can't pay while others contribute extra. Time banks let members exchange skills without money. An hour of carpentry for an hour of guitar lessons, echoing the indigenous focus on reciprocity over profit. Even the digital world hints at this shift, with open-source software developers giving away code that powers global tech giants. But the potlatch's deepest lesson isn't about swapping goods, it's about rewiring our minds around abundance. Neuroeconomic studies show that giving activates the same brain regions as receiving, while hoarding triggers stress responses. The Kwakwaka'wakwa understood this instinctively. Their word for wealthy didn't mean having much, but giving much. Compare that to modern life, where loneliness spikes alongside GDP, and it's clear something got lost in translation. Perhaps the most radical question isn't whether we could adopt gift economies, but whether we already have, just imperfectly. Every time you babysit a friend's child without charging, or bring soup to a sick neighbor, you're participating in a shadow economy older than money. The difference is that for the Tlingit, these acts weren't sidelined as informal, they were the very fabric of society. Rebuilding that fabric might start with something as simple as asking, what if wealth isn't what we keep, but what we dare to give away? Now consider how these same cultures harnessed the mind's untapped capacities, not through apps or hustle culture, but through practices modern science is only beginning to fathom. The Tsimshian shamans who entered trance states to diagnose illness weren't just performing rituals. They were accessing what psychologists now call the default mode network, the brain's problem-solving mode activated during deep meditation. Their primitive ceremonies anticipated biohacking by centuries. The steady beat of a shaman's drum isn't just rhythm, it's a vehicle, carrying consciousness across thresholds most modern minds have forgotten exist. For the Sami people of Scandinavia, the drum's repetitive pulse mimics the heart's own cadence, guiding practitioners into trance states where time dissolves and visions arise. What outsiders once dismissed as superstition, neuroscientists now measure. At 4 to 7 beats per second, these drum patterns synchronize with theta brainwaves, the same frequencies observed during deep meditation and REM sleep. It's as if these cultures cracked the code to hacking human awareness long before EEG machines existed, using nothing but stretched hide and disciplined intention. Then there's the Shipibo healers of the Amazon, whose ayahuasca ceremonies blend botany with what we'd now call neurochemistry. The vine's DMT, a compound our brains produce naturally during dreaming, acts like a key, unlocking receptors that heighten sensory perception and dissolve the ego's boundaries. But here's what Western science often misses. The Shipibo don't just drink the brew and wait, they sing. Their ikaros, intricate melodies passed down through generations, are sonic scaffolds that guide the experience, much like a surgeon's skilled hands direct a scalpel. Brain scans of participants show these songs stabilize neural activity, preventing the chaotic firing that can lead to traumatic trips. This isn't pharmacology versus spirituality, it's their seamless integration. Fasting, another ancient doorway, reveals similar sophistication. The Huicol people of Mexico embark on peyote pilgrimages after days without food, a practice modern researchers now understand primes the brain for altered states. Deprived of glucose, the mind shifts to ketosis, a metabolic mode that sharpens focus and boosts neuroplasticity, ideal conditions for visionary experiences. Combine this with the desert's sensory deprivation, and you have a natural laboratory for consciousness exploration, one that predates Silicon Valley's biohacking fads by millennia. What unites these practices isn't just altered states, but their purpose, problem-solving. A Mongolian shaman might enter trance to locate lost livestock in blizzards, her mind accessing spatial memory with uncanny precision. A Kalahari San elder, dancing for hours under the stars, receives intricate hunting maps in visions routes later verified by satellite imagery. These aren't hallucinations in the clinical sense. They're heightened states of cognition, where the brain's filtering mechanisms relax, allowing subconscious insights to surface. Modern creatives chase similar flow states through drugs or extreme sports, unaware that safer pathways exist in these ancestral toolkits. The most radical idea here isn't that these methods work, it's that they were systematic. Siberian shamans had strict training regimens, years memorizing plant lore, weeks in ice caves mastering body temperature control, rituals to test their mental resilience. This wasn't random mysticism, it was a rigorous curriculum for navigating consciousness's hidden layers. When psychologists study expert meditators like Tibetan monks, they find similar discipline yields measurable brain changes, increased gamma wave activity, thicker prefrontal cortices. The difference: science is just beginning to map what shamans charted through trial and error across generations. This brings us to death, but not as we typically frame it. Where modern medicine often views dying as a failure, these cultures saw it as the ultimate altered state, a transition woven into life's fabric. The Dagara of Burkina Faso bury their dead sitting upright, positioned to face the community they'll spiritually watch over. Tibetan Buddhists recite the Bardo Thirdol, a guidebook for consciousness navigating the afterlife, its descriptions eerily matching near-death experiences reported today. These traditions share a startling perspective. Death isn't an end, but a transformation our minds can prepare for, much like the shaman prepares for trance. Perhaps that's the real revelation. These cultures didn't just explore consciousness, they cultivated relationships with it, learning its terrains as intimately as hunters knew forests. In doing so, they discovered what we're now relearning, that the mind is vaster than we suppose, and its deepest capacities awaken not through force, but through reverence. The drum still beats, the vines still grow, and the old paths remain waiting for those willing to listen differently. For the Tibetan nomads, death isn't an ending, it's a final act of generosity. In sky burials, bodies are carried to sacred peaks, carefully disassembled, and left for vultures in a ritual called ajata, meaning giving alms to the birds. To outsiders, this might seem stark, but the philosophy behind it is profound. The body, now empty of spirit, becomes nourishment for other lives, completing the cycle of interdependence that defined the deceased's earthly existence. The bones are then ground with barley flour, so even the last remnants return to the earth. No coffins, no headstones, just pure reciprocity. This practice wasn't born from indifference, but from a radical intimacy with mortality, where death wasn't hidden behind hospital curtains, but integrated into the community's daily rhythm. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the Dia de los Muertos transforms grief into celebration. Families build altars adorned with marigolds, the petals vibrant orange guiding spirits back home. They set out plates of mole and pan de muerto, not as symbolic gestures, but as genuine offerings, because in this worldview, the dead remain active participants in family life. Children laugh as they nibble sugar skulls inscribed with their own names, a playful reminder that mortality isn't a taboo but a familiar neighbor. Anthropologists studying bereavement in Osaka found that this annual reunion, where sorrow and joy coexist, reduces prolonged grief disorder significantly compared to cultures that treat death as a private, somber event. The Dagara people of West Africa take this further. When someone dies, they're not buried immediately. Instead, the body rests in the village for days while elders converse with the spirit, asking about unresolved grievances or unfulfilled wishes. Only once the spirit confirms readiness does burial occur, a process that can take weeks. Psychologists recognize this as a form of narrative therapy, allowing the living to process loss through ongoing dialogue rather than abrupt separation. Compare that to modern funerals, where embalming and rushed ceremonies often leave mourners feeling severed mid-sentence from those they love. What unites these traditions is their refusal to exile the dead. The Toraja of Indonesia keep deceased relatives in their homes for months or even years, dressing and caring for them until funds are saved for an elaborate funeral. During this waiting period, the deceased is referred to as Temacula, and not the corpse, but the one who is sick. This linguistic nuance reflects a belief that death isn't instantaneous, but a gradual transition where the community's love eases the journey. Modern hospice nurses unknowingly echo this wisdom when they encourage families to keep talking to loved ones in comas, noting how vital signs often stabilize at the sound of familiar voices. This brings us to the heart of the matter. Our modern alienation from death fuels more than just existential dread, it distorts how we live. When the Aymara of the Andes speak of the future, they gesture behind them because the unseen, what's ahead, is unknowable, while the past stretches visibly before their eyes. Similarly, their rituals treat death not as a void, but as a presence that shapes daily choices. Studies show that cultures with robust death traditions exhibit lower rates of midlife crises, as the constant awareness of mortality becomes a compass rather than a threat. Yet for all their diversity, these rituals share a common thread. They're not about the dead but the living. The Maori practice of tangi, where mourners gather for days of storytelling and song, doesn't just honor the departed, it reaffirms the community's resilience. When grief is collectively carried, its weight becomes bearable. Modern therapy groups have begun adopting similar models, with death cafes where strangers share stories over tea, proving that even in our fragmented world, the ancient need to grieve together persists. Now consider how this acceptance of life's cyclical nature shaped their most practical survival strategies, like the way the Nabateans of Petra carved a thriving city from desert cliffs by mastering water's invisible language. Just as they honored the threshold between life and death, they learned to listen to the whispers of arid land, turning scarcity into abundance through methods we're only beginning to understand. The Nabateans didn't just build Petra's towering facades, they engineered an invisible lifeline beneath them. In a land where rain fell barely 5 days a year, they carved channels so precise they lost only 3% of water over miles of sandstone. Their secret wasn't force but finesse. Instead of fighting gravity, they followed it, using ceramic pipes with just enough slope to maintain flow without erosion. They hid cisterns beneath temple floors, collecting dew through condensation channels, a technique modern engineers now mimic in drought zones. The real marvel wasn't their tools, but their philosophy. Water wasn't a resource to control, but a rhythm to join. Half a world away, Bali's Subak system turned competition into cooperation. For over 1,000 years, farmers have shared irrigation water through a network of canals and weirs governed not by officials but by temple priests. Every planting season, communities gather at water temples to negotiate allocations based on crop cycles and sacred calendars. The result? terraces that have flourished for centuries without depletion, where pests are managed by synchronized fallow periods rather than pesticides. Scientists studying subac found it aligns perfectly with modern agroecology, its staggered planting disrupting pest breeding cycles naturally. UNESCO recognized it as a World Heritage Site, but the real tribute is in its endurance, a system where water disputes are settled with offerings, not lawsuits. What unites these systems is their rejection of scarcity thinking. The Nabateans didn't hoard water, they redistributed it through public fountains and baths, knowing shared resources bind communities. The Balinese prioritize triheta karana, harmony between humans, nature, and the divine, a principle that turns irrigation into ritual. Compare that to today's water wars, where drained aquifers and privatized utilities pit neighbor against neighbor. These ancient models whisper an alternative. Abundance grows from reciprocity. Now consider how their legacy echoes in unlikely places. Arizona's Desert Archaeology Institute now studies Nabatean techniques to revive desert agriculture, while California's vineyards experiment with subac-inspired water-sharing packs during droughts. Even high-tech solutions like fog nets, which harvest moisture from coastal air, borrow from the Nabatean playbook, working with nature's patterns rather than overriding them. The lesson isn't about replicating stone channels, but rediscovering their mindset. That survival in harsh lands begins with humility, not conquest. This brings us to a truth even deeper than hydraulics. For these cultures, water wasn't just functional, it was sacred. The Nabateans carved their most elaborate facades around springs, honoring them as divine gifts. Balinese farmers still leave daily offerings at canal gates, not out of superstition, but to sustain gratitude for the unseen networks that nourish them. In an age where tap water arrives anonymously through pipes, we've lost more than techniques, we've severed the stories that made conservation a moral act. Perhaps that's why ancient systems endured. They weren't just sustaining resources, but meaning. Now imagine applying that wisdom to play. If water management could be both practical and sacred, what might that reveal about societies that treated games not as distractions, but as vital rituals? The Maya's life or death ball games and the Inuits' throat-singing competitions weren't mere entertainment. They were training grounds for survival, woven into the fabric of cultural resilience. When a society elevates play to reverence, it's not escaping reality, it's mastering it through joy. The thunderous echo of a rubber ball striking stone wasn't just sport, it was diplomacy in motion. For the Maya, their sacred ball game, pits, settled disputes between city-states without warfare, where victory wasn't measured in points but in divine favor. Players used hips and elbows to propel a heavy ball through stone hoops, their movements mirroring the cosmic battle between life and death. But beneath the spectacle lay sophisticated conflict resolution. Losing nobles might be spared execution if they played with honor, their courage transforming defeat into spiritual currency. Archaeologists studying ball court carvings found they often depicted captives playing for their freedom, a ritual where competition became conversation, violence transmuted into symbolic struggle. Meanwhile, on the Arctic ice, Inuit girls as young as 6 engaged in throat-singing duels called katajak, their rhythmic exchanges far more than entertainment. Pressing foreheads together, they traded guttural sounds in a game mimicking animal call seals, geese, even the wind itself. What seemed like playful mimicry was actually survival training. The breath control mastered through these contests allowed hunters to silently stalk prey for hours in freezing temperatures. Modern pulmonologists confirm these techniques improve lung capacity and cold tolerance, proving how play doubled as preparation. But the deeper brilliance lay in its social function. These singing battles strengthened community bonds while diffusing tensions between families, much like the Maya's ball game. From the Aztec patole gambling rituals that redistributed wealth to Celtic hurling matches that settled land disputes, ancient societies treated play as serious business. The Cherokee stickball games, ancestor to modern lacrosse, could last for days with hundreds of players, healing inter-village rifts through shared exhaustion and exhilaration. Anthropologists note these games often lacked referees. Integrity was maintained through collective expectation, training citizens in self-governance as much as athleticism. Even the Vikings' Natalica, a brutal precursor to hockey, served as winter diplomacy when frozen seas halted trade and tensions simmered. Contrast this with modern leisure's segregation: gyms for fitness, theaters for storytelling, parks for scheduled recreation. We've fractured what these cultures kept whole, the understanding that play isn't opposite to productivity, but its foundation. Silicon Valley tech firms are belatedly rediscovering this truth with ping-pong tables and hackathons, yet still treat them as perks rather than essentials. Neuropsychologists studying improvisational theater troupes found their collaborative games spark neural plasticity, enhancing problem-solving skills more than traditional brainstorming. The Kalahari Bushmen knew this instinctively. Their children's hunting games developed tracking skills while fostering cooperation that prevents hoarding in adulthood. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in how these societies celebrated failure. In Maori haka war dances, missteps weren't mocked but corrected through repetition until the group moved as one. The Yupik of Alaska staged wrestling matches where the goal wasn't victory but endurance, applauding both participants equally. This reframed setbacks as stepping stones, a mindset modern educators now promote as growth mindset, unaware of its ancient roots. When play becomes purposeful, every stumble becomes part of the dance. Now, listen closely beyond the drumbeats and laughter. These cultures were fluent in another language, the whispers of the wild. Just as their games blurred the line between pleasure and survival, their ability to interpret animal communication revealed a world where every growl, chirp, and footprint told a story. The Hadza hunters of Tanzania can distinguish over 20 bird alarm calls, each signaling different predators approaching. The Tuvan shepherds of Mongolia learn to mimic wolf howls so accurately they can steer entire packs away from livestock without a single bullet. This wasn't magic, it was millennia of patient observation, proving that the first field guides weren't printed on paper, but etched into human memory through generations of careful listening. A single footprint in the red dust tells more than just size and speed. It reveals a story. Aboriginal trackers in Australia's outback can glance at a set of kangaroo prints and tell you not just where the animal was going, but whether it was hungry, injured, or fleeing a predator. They read the land like a living newspaper, interpreting broken twigs, disturbed spiderwebs, and even the way sand grains settle as part of a narrative modern wildlife biologists are only beginning to decode. This isn't just tracking, it's a dialogue with the earth, where every mark is a word and every trail a sentence waiting to be understood. The Maasai of East Africa took this further, treating predators not as threats but as professors. Young warriors would spend days shadowing lions, studying how the big cats moved through tall grass without a sound, how they timed their attacks after reading the wind's direction. The Maasai didn't conquer the savannah, they apprenticed under it, adopting lion-like stealth for their own hunts. What Western science might call mimicry, they understood as kinship. A warrior who mastered the lion's patience was said to carry Alamayo, the spirit of shared wisdom between species. This reverence for animal intelligence wasn't sentimental, it was empirical. Long before Jane Goodall documented chimps using tools, the Baka people of Central Africa watched forest elephants mourn their dead, covering bodies with leaves and returning years later to touch the bones with their trunks. Pacific Islanders navigated vast oceans by memorizing the flight paths of shorebirds, while the Quechua in the Andes still predict weather shifts by observing llama behavior. These weren't superstitions, they were data points in a vast intergenerational study of non-human cognition. Modern science now confirms what these cultures always knew. Crows fashion hook tools from branches, octopuses solve complex puzzles, and prairie dogs communicate in syntax-rich sentences describing predator details. Elephants recognize themselves in mirrors, dolphins name each other with signature whistles, and chimpanzees outperform humans in some memory tests. The gap between animal instinct and human intelligence grows thinner with each discovery, revealing a continuum of consciousness we've barely begun to map. Yet something vital was lost when we stopped seeing animals as teachers. The ecological rift we face today isn't just about pollution or deforestation, it's a failure of attention. Where indigenous hunters whispered thanks to the deer they killed, industrial farming treats living beings as assembly line units. The Koyukon people of Alaska describe this disconnect as walking past the teachers, ignoring the subtle lessons embedded in every rustling leaf or bird call. Reconnecting doesn't require abandoning modernity, just reawakening our senses. Wildlife biologists now train with Aboriginal trackers to monitor endangered species without intrusive collars. Architects study termite mounds to design passive cooling buildings, while engineers analyze humpback whale fins for wind turbine designs. Even medicine looks to animals, from studying bear hibernation to prevent muscle atrophy in astronauts to harvesting peptides from alligator blood as potent antibiotics. The irony is stark. The more we advance, the more we circle back to truths embedded in ancient relationships. Perhaps the deepest lesson lies in how these cultures listened. The Hadza of Tanzania can identify individual bees by the pitch of their wings, a skill that leads them to hidden hives. The Tuvan shepherds of Mongolia distinguish wolf packs by their howls, recognizing distinct voices like neighbors across a valley. This wasn't just survival, it was participation in a conversation older than language itself. Now, consider the space between sounds not as emptiness, but as its own kind of speech. Just as these cultures deciphered meaning in animal movements, they understood silence as a language too, one that modern noise has nearly drowned out. The Inupiat of Alaska call it Quvianaktuk, the listening stillness that settles over tundra when predators are near. The Apache hunters would sit motionless for hours, not just to avoid startling prey, but to hear the land's whispers. In a world of constant alerts and endless chatter, their wisdom whispers back. Sometimes the deepest truths aren't spoken aloud but felt in the quiet. In the vast silence of the Kalahari, a Bushman hunter raises his hand not to speak but to pause. The air hums with unspoken meaning as his companions freeze mid-step, reading the angle of his fingers like words on a page. This is the art of silent communication, where clicks and gestures carry more weight than paragraphs, and the space between sounds speaks volumes. The Bushmen's languages, rich with intricate clicks, weave silence into their very structure. A pause after a particular click might distinguish waterhole from danger, turning absence into information. Meanwhile, Inuit hunters tracking seals across ice communicate not with shouts, but with subtle shifts in posture, a tilt of the head signaling stop, a slow exhale meaning listen. These languages weren't designed for efficiency. They were honed by necessity, where a single misplaced word could startle prey or avalanche. Modern life has drowned out this subtlety. Constant notifications, background music, and the hum of machinery create a wall of noise that makes deep listening nearly impossible. Studies show the average person now spends less than 3 seconds waiting before interrupting a conversation, a far cry from the Bushman practice of allowing long, thoughtful silences to unfold. Even our language reflects this shift. We describe quiet as awkward rather than sacred and fill every gap with small talk. Yet the consequences go beyond social discomfort. Noise pollution has been linked to increased stress hormones, reduced cognitive function, and even disrupted ecosystems as animals struggle to communicate over human-made sounds. What's lost when silence vanishes? The Yupik people of Alaska offer a clue. Their word, Elam Inga, the awareness of the universe, describes the intuitive knowledge that arises when one sits quietly in nature, listening not just with ears but with skin and bone. Anthropologists documented hunters who could predict weather changes by sensing shifts in air pressure long before clouds appeared, a skill cultivated through years of attentive silence. Similarly, the Hadza of Tanzania identify beehives hidden deep in baobab trees by distinguishing the faintest buzz from the wind, a frequency modern microphones often miss. These aren't supernatural gifts, they're the natural results of minds undistracted, tuned like instruments to their environment. The irony is that science now confirms what indigenous cultures practiced all along. Research on gap detection thresholds reveals that trained musicians and meditators like the Bushmen with their click languages can perceive micro-silences between sounds far better than the average person. These tiny pauses, it turns out, are where meaning crystallizes. Just as the Inuits' subtle gestures conveyed complex hunting strategies without alerting prey, modern therapists use deliberate silences to help clients access deeper emotions. Even artificial intelligence struggles to replicate human conversation because it can't yet master the dance of pauses and breaths that give speech its rhythm and nuance. This brings us to gender, another realm where silence speaks volumes. Many indigenous cultures recognized roles beyond binary divisions, not through loud proclamations, but through quiet acceptance. The Diné Navajo concept of Nadli honors those who embody both masculine and feminine spirits, their presence woven into the social fabric without fanfare. Similarly, the Bugis people of Indonesia acknowledge 5 genders, their language reflecting a spectrum of being that requires no justification. These societies didn't need debates or legislation to validate diversity. They simply observed nature's variety and followed its lead. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in how these cultures held space for the unspoken, where modern gender discussions often dissolve into polarized shouting matches. Traditions like Hawaii's Mahu, individuals who transcend male/female categories, were historically the keepers of oral histories and healing arts, their wisdom transmitted through patient listening rather than force. In a world obsessed with defining everything, their power came from dwelling comfortably in ambiguity, proving that some truths are too vast for words alone. The thread connecting silent communication and fluid gender roles is respect for the unsaid, the unseen, and the unclassified. Just as the Bushmen's clicks honor the intelligence of pauses, indigenous gender systems honor the intelligence of diversity. Both remind us that humanity's deepest connections often happen not in the clamor of certainty, but in the quiet spaces between. Among the Zuni people of the American Southwest, a child who showed gifts for both weaving and hunting might be recognized as Lamana, a person embodying both masculine and feminine spirits. Rather than forcing them into rigid roles, the community celebrated this duality, believing such individuals held special wisdom to bridge divides. The Lamana wore mixed clothing styles, performed tasks across gender lines, and often became revered healers or mediators. Similar traditions flourished globally. India's Hera communities, Samoa's Fafafine, and the Balkan sworn virgins all wove fluid identities into their social fabric without stigma. These weren't exceptions to the rule, they were proof that human diversity has always existed, just interpreted differently across cultures. Shamans in particular blurred these boundaries with purpose. In Siberia, a male shaman might adopt women's clothing during rituals, not as performance but as a sacred act channeling the feminine to access spiritual realms. The Chukchi people believed such individuals could turn into the opposite sex temporarily, gaining unique visionary powers. Modern anthropologists note that these roles weren't about identity politics, but about utility. By transcending binaries, these mediators could navigate multiple dimensions of existence. A two-spirit crow person might negotiate peace between warring tribes precisely because their perspective transcended conventional divisions. The contrast with today's polarized debates is stark. Where contemporary society often frames gender discussions as battles over rights, indigenous cultures treated fluidity as a natural resource, like rainfall or fertile soil, to be harnessed for communal benefit. The Bugis of Indonesia still recognize 5 genders, with Bisu, shamans neither male nor female, traditionally blessing rice harvests and officiating royal weddings. Their existence wasn't tolerated, it was essential. Perhaps the most radical lesson lies in how these societies institutionalized inclusion without bureaucracy. No laws mandated two-spirit participation in tribal councils. Their voices were valued because difference bred better decisions. Studies on diverse teams confirm this ancient intuition. Groups with varied perspectives solve complex problems faster. The Mohawk Kanyankiha Ka people assigned two-spirit individuals as keepers of oral histories, recognizing that those who stood between categories could see connections others missed. Now consider how this same holistic thinking transformed something even more tangible, waste. Where modern landfills overflow, the Maori saw discarded flax fibers and fashioned them into resilient ropes. The Inuit turned seal blubber into lamps, sinew into thread, bones into tools, leaving nothing to rot. Their genius wasn't just recycling, but reimagining trash as tomorrow's treasure long before sustainability became a buzzword. Zero waste wasn't a lifestyle choice for the Hadza, it was survival refined over millennia. When these Tanzanian hunter-gatherers harvest a honey-guide bird's lead to a beehive, they leave a portion of the comb behind as thanks, ensuring future collaboration. The animal bones they carve into arrowheads become jewelry once blunted, then ground into pigment when worn. Even the sinew and tendons find purpose as bowstrings or thread, completing a cycle where waste simply doesn't exist. This isn't frugality, it's a profound recognition that every element of existence holds latent value, waiting to be unlocked through creativity and patience. High in the Himalayas, the Sherpa people practice a form of circular living that would stump modern waste managers. Human waste, carefully composted with juniper ash and straw, transforms into night soil, a nutrient-rich fertilizer that sustains terraced potato fields in thin mountain air where synthetic alternatives fail. Their stone homes, built without mortar, can be disassembled and rebuilt elsewhere, leaving no trace on the landscape. Compare that to today's construction industry, responsible for 1/3 of global landfill waste, and the contrast is stark. Where we see expendable materials, they saw transient tools in an endless loop of use and renewal. This philosophy extended to the most unexpected places. The Inuit turned seal bladders into floating fishing line markers, while the Maasai crafted intricate jewelry from recycled wire and beads traded over generations. In the Amazon, Yanomami hunters used poison dart frog venom sparingly, never harvesting more than needed. and always singing gratitude songs to the frogs, a ritual that ensured both ecological balance and a steady supply. These practices weren't driven by environmental ethics as we know them, but by an ingrained understanding that resources were relationships, not commodities. The modern recycling movement pales in comparison. Despite our advanced technology, only 9% of plastics ever produced have been recycled, while primitive societies achieved near total reuse with nothing but ingenuity. The difference lies in design. Indigenous systems were circular by default, whereas our linear take-make-waste model requires costly interventions to retrofit. When a Navajo weaver unravels an old blanket to create a new pattern, she's not recycling, she's participating in a continuum where materials have infinite potential through transformation. What if waste is merely a symptom of disconnection? The Kung Bushmen laugh at the idea of throwing away a broken tool. How can the land give gifts, they ask, if we treat them as trash? Their language lacks a word for waste because their worldview assumes regeneration. Modern zero-waste advocates are now echoing this ancient logic, from chefs fermenting vegetable scraps into gourmet garums to architects designing buildings as material banks for future deconstruction. The lesson isn't to abandon technology, but to rewire our perception, to see every byproduct not as an endpoint, but as the next iteration's raw material. Now, listen closely, because these same cultures turned even sound into a resource. Just as they harnessed every physical element, they attuned their music to nature's frequencies, creating harmonies that vibrated in sync with the world around them. The Aboriginal didgeridoos drone mirrors the resonant frequency of the earth itself, while Tibetan singing bowls produce tones that neurologists now recognize as brainwave entrainment tools. This wasn't entertainment, it was acoustic ecology, proof that the deepest sustainability includes the invisible vibrations weaving life together. The resonant drone of a didgeridoo doesn't just fill the air, it vibrates through the earth beneath your feet, a sound so deep it seems to rise from the land itself. For the Yolngu people of Australia, this isn't mere music, it's a conversation with the natural world. Skilled players mimic the growl of a dingo, the screech of a cockatoo, even the distant rumble of thunder, weaving these sounds into rhythms that mirror the pulse of the wilderness. Neuroacoustic researchers studying these patterns found something remarkable. Frequencies between 40 and 60 Hz, the same range as the didgeridoo's bass tones, stimulate theta brainwaves associated with deep relaxation and creativity. It's as if the instrument was acoustically designed to harmonize human biology with the environment. Meanwhile, in the Central African rainforests, Ba'aka pygmy singers demonstrate another layer of this sonic symbiosis. Their polyphonic singing, where multiple overlapping melodies create a dense, shimmering texture, doesn't follow rigid scales. Instead, it ebbs and flows like wind through leaves, with pitches sliding between notes in a way Western notation can't capture. Ethnomusicologists discovered these fluid harmonies precisely match the rainforest's own sound profile, where bird calls and insect choruses layer unpredictably. When Ba'aka women sing while gathering fruit, their voices blend so seamlessly with the ambient sounds that predators struggle to locate them, a survival strategy disguised as song. What unites these traditions is their refusal to separate music from ecology. The Aboriginal songlines that encode navigation routes in melody also serve as acoustic maps, their rhythms aligned with landmarks' resonant frequencies. A skilled player can literally feel when the didgeridoo's vibrations sync with a canyon's natural echo, confirming they're on the right path. Similarly, the Temaya people of Malaysia compose dream songs inspired by plant spirits, believing each species emits unique vibrational patterns that healers can channel. Modern bioacoustics lends credence to this. Studies show plants exposed to certain frequencies grow faster, while mycorrhizal fungal networks communicate through electrical pulses akin to musical rhythms. This challenges our very definition of music. Where Western classical traditions prioritize composition and performance, these cultures treat sound as connective tissue, a medium binding humans to their surroundings. The Sami yoik, for instance, isn't a song about a reindeer. It becomes the reindeer, its melodic contours mirroring the animal's gait and spirit. Neurologists note that yoiks activate the brain's mirror neuron system, causing listeners to viscerally experience the subject's essence. No concert hall needed, the tundra itself becomes the auditorium. The health implications are profound. Clinics from Berlin to Tokyo now incorporate natural soundscapes into therapy, finding that recordings of rainforest or ocean sounds lower cortisol levels more effectively than white noise. Finnish researchers designed a sound shower using frequencies inspired by Sami chanting, which reduced chronic pain symptoms in 60% of participants. But these modern applications only scratch the surface. Indigenous sound traditions suggest true healing comes not from passive listening, but from active participation, when human voices and instruments join nature's chorus as equal partners, not observers. This brings us to dreams, those mysterious nocturnal journeys where the mind converses with itself in symbols. Just as indigenous music erases the line between performer and environment, many cultures view dreaming not as escape from reality, but as a vital extension of it. The Senoi people of Malaysia held dawn councils where children recounted dreams, which the tribe then collectively interpreted to guide daily decisions. A dream of falling might prompt a village to reinforce bridge ropes, while a vision of bees could send harvesters searching for wild honey. Psychologists studying Senoi communities in the 1960s found remarkably low rates of mental illness, leading some to theorize that their dream integration acted as preventive therapy. The Iroquois Confederacy took this further, considering dreams so vital to communal well-being that they appointed special dream interpreters to decode messages from the spirit world. If a leader dreamed of a new law, it was debated seriously, not as superstition, but as intelligence gathered from a broader realm of consciousness. Modern sleep science hints at why this worked. REM sleep enhances problem solving by reorganizing memories into novel patterns. The Iroquois were essentially crowdsourcing innovation through curated dreaming. Perhaps the most striking convergence of sound and dream wisdom comes from the Amazon's Shipibo people. Their healers sing Icaros, dream-inspired melodies during ayahuasca ceremonies, with each song tailored to the patient's visions. The intricate geometric patterns in Shipibo textiles aren't just designs, they're visual representations of these healing songs, their flowing lines mirroring melodic contours. When researchers played recorded Icaros to non-indigenous volunteers, EEG scans showed enhanced gamma wave activity, the same brain state linked to heightened insight and sensory integration. It's as if the songs themselves were bridges between waking and dreaming states. What emerges from these traditions is a radical redefinition of consciousness. They suggest that music and dreams aren't separate phenomena, but complementary channels through which humans dialogue with larger patterns, whether ecological, social, or spiritual. In a world where insomnia is epidemic and earbuds seal us into private sound bubbles, their wisdom whispers an alternative. That wellness might begin when we stop trying to dominate our inner and outer soundscapes and instead learn to listen and sing along. Dreams weren't just nightly entertainment for the Senoi, they were council meetings where the subconscious tabled urgent business. Each morning, families gathered to dissect the previous night's visions, treating them with the gravity of a tribal summit. A child's nightmare about falling became a community project. elders guided them to rewrite the dreams, ending by imagining wings or a safe landing, transforming fear into agency. Adults shared cryptic symbols: a flooded river, a talking hawk, and the group brainstormed real-world parallels, that peculiar dream about a broken spear. It might prompt a hunter to check his tools before heading into the jungle. Modern therapists call this dream rehearsal therapy, a technique now used to treat PTSD. But for the Senoi, it was simply how mornings began, proof that the sleeping mind holds solutions the waking world overlooks. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks built sprawling sanctuaries like the Temple of Asclepius, where the sick slept in sacred chambers called a baton, awaiting diagnostic or healing dreams. Priests interpreted visions of snakes, the god's symbol, licking wounds, as signs of impending recovery. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as superstition until neuroscientists discovered that during REM sleep, the brain releases a flood of tissue repair hormones and consolidates motor skills. The Greeks weren't just praying for miracles, they were harnessing sleep's innate restorative power through ritual. Contemporary research now confirms what these cultures intuited. Studies at Harvard's sleep lab show people solving complex puzzles 30% faster after dreaming about them, while emotional dreams help metabolize difficult experiences by replaying them in a neurochemical, safe mode. The Senoi's practice of sharing dreams likely functioned as preventive mental health care, processing anxieties communally before they could fester. Contrast that with modern life, where we often wake to blaring alarms, hastily dismissing last night's dreamscape as irrelevant noise. But perhaps the most profound insight lies in how indigenous cultures framed dreaming not as a solitary brain event, but as a conversation. The Iroquois saw dreams as messages from ancestors or the natural world, with visions of thirsty deer prompting real waterhole repairs. Aboriginal Australians describe dream time as an eternal present where past and future coexist, guiding daily decisions through symbolic visions. This wasn't mystical escapism. It was systems thinking in symbolic form, where dreams revealed interconnected patterns the logical mind might miss. Now picture carrying this wisdom into modern nights. Imagine a world where instead of doom-scrolling before bed, we prepared for sleep like the Senoi, with quiet reflection on unsolved problems, trusting our minds to work on them offline. Where morning coffee included sharing dreams with housemates, mining them for creative sparks or emotional clues, some tech startups are already experimenting with this, using AI voice assistants to log dream fragments upon waking. But the real shift isn't technological, it's cultural. To reclaim dreaming as dialogue is to acknowledge that consciousness isn't confined to daylight hours, and that some truths only emerge when we surrender control. This brings us to fire, another force primitive cultures understood on levels deeper than utility. Just as dreams bridged seen and unseen worlds, flames were more than heat sources. They were living portals where stories, spirits, and transformation converged. The flickering light that let our ancestors stay awake after dark did something even more vital. It redefined what it meant to be human. Fire crackled in the Ainu hearth not just for warmth, but as a living guest, honored with offerings of rice and salt, spoken to in prayers that rose with the smoke. These indigenous people of Japan understood something modern societies have forgotten, that flames hold consciousness. Their Ape-Fachai, fire goddess, wasn't mythology. She was an expression of the observable truth that fire transforms everything it touches, purifying spaces physically and spiritually. Across continents, the Zoroastrians built eternal flames in their temples, believing fire carried prayers directly to the divine. A single spark could bridge earth and heaven, its flickering dance mirroring the human soul's restless yearning. What's startling is how universal this reverence was. Celtic Druids kindled bonfires at solstices to strengthen the weakening sun. The Hindu Agni ceremony still channels sacred fire to sanctify weddings, its heat symbolizing the unbreakable bond. Even the Lakota sun dance, where dancers gaze at the sun until visions emerge, centers around a consecrated fire representing the universe's heartbeat. These traditions recognized fire's dual nature. It could cook meals and burn villages, forge tools and destroy forests, making its mastery as much about spiritual discipline as physical control. Modern life has reduced fire to a switch flipper, gas stoves without ceremony, electric heaters devoid of stories. We've gained convenience but lost the ritual that transformed a primal force into sacred technology. Pyrotherapists are now rediscovering this wisdom, using controlled fire ceremonies to help veterans process trauma. Participants report that writing fears on paper and watching them burn creates catharsis no talk therapy can match. It's as if the ancient intuition was right. Fire doesn't just change matter, it transmutes emotion. This brings us to the living libraries who kept these flames alive, not in books but in memory. Elders in indigenous cultures weren't retirees waiting for the end. They were the breath of continuity. A Kung grandmother in the Kalahari might not read, but she carries mental maps of every waterhole within 200 miles, recalling rainfall patterns from 80 years past. A Sami reindeer herder in Lapland knows which lichen species signal safe grazing under winter snows knowledge textbooks can't capture because it's woven into lived experience. The difference between these traditions and modern academia is the difference between a wildfire and a gas lamp. Western education isolates facts, while elder wisdom connects them, understanding that the timing of berry ripening relates to salmon runs, which connects to the moon's phases. The Yupik of Alaska call this Elam Yua, the intelligence of the universe's interconnectedness. Their elders don't just recite names of plants, they sing the relationships between them, embedding ecology in narrative so it sticks like sap. Consider how they trained these human libraries. A Maori Tohunga scholar spent decades memorizing genealogies so precise they doubled as land deeds, their chanted lineages proving ancestral rights. Tibetan monks still practice lung, memorizing thousands of pages by heart, not as rote repetition, but through visualization techniques that turn texts into mental landscapes. Neuroscientists studying these methods find they activate both hippocampus and visual cortex, creating recall systems more resilient than digital backups. Yet today, we warehouse elders in retirement communities, segregating them from the daily flow of knowledge. Studies show Alzheimer's rates are significantly lower among cultures where seniors remain socially integrated, suggesting engagement isn't just good for the soul, it preserves the mind. The Tsimane people of Bolivia demonstrate this daily. Their elders, though physically frail, lead foraging trips because no one else can identify the subtlest edible fungi or medicinal barks. What if we rekindled both fires, the literal and metaphorical? Imagine intergenerational learning hubs where elders teach children to start friction fires while sharing stories of resilience. Tech startups are already experimenting with this, pairing Silicon Valley engineers with Lakota storytellers to blend coding with oral tradition. The results: more ethical AI designs rooted in long-term thinking. The Ainu's sacred fire and the Sami's reindeer songs remind us that wisdom isn't stored in clouds or servers, but in the living breath of those who have tended the flames longest. Perhaps progress doesn't mean outrunning the past, but walking beside it, letting its embers light our way forward. Elders in indigenous communities carried entire universes inside their memories, every wrinkle a chapter, every scar a map. The Tsimane people of Bolivia measure time not in years but in knowledge earned. A grandmother might recite 50 generations of family lineage while identifying hundreds of medicinal plants by smell alone. Her hands, gnarled from decades grinding maize, can detect the precise moment wild tubers reach peak sweetness by tapping their skins, a skill agricultural scientists now study to improve crop resilience. These elders aren't just repositories, they're active transmitters, weaving lessons into stories so vivid they bypass the analytical mind and lodge directly in muscle memory. When a Tsimane child learns to track animals, they don't memorize footprints, they internalize the elders' dramatic reenactments of jaguar hunts, complete with leaf-rustling sound effects that train the ear as effectively as any audio textbook. Contrast this with modern retirement, where we've swapped intergenerational apprenticeships for solitary bingo nights. Studies show nursing home residents experience cognitive decline up to 3 times faster than elders embedded in family life, not from disease but disconnection. The irony stings. Societies with the most advanced medical technology are starving their oldest members of the very thing that sustains cognition, purposeful contribution. The Maori have a saying, "Hia hati mi nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata." What is the most important thing? It is people, it is people, it is people. Their Maori meeting houses place elders at the literal center, where their voices shape decisions and their laughter seeds resilience. Yet buried in this contrast lies an unexpected solution to modernity's loneliness epidemic. The Sardinians of Italy, home to one of the world's highest concentrations of centenarians, don't just tolerate their elders, they harness them. Non-NAS teach neighborhood children to make pasta by hand, transforming kitchen tables into social hubs. Retired shepherds lead hiking groups, their encyclopedic knowledge of mountain trails preventing isolation for themselves and forging bonds among younger participants. Gerontologists found these practices produce physiological benefits mimicking anti-aging drugs, lowered inflammation markers, stabilized blood pressure, even longer telomeres. The secret isn't genetics, it's what psychologists call generativity, the act of nurturing future generations. Some innovators are bridging these worlds. Tokyo's Nursing Home University employs seniors as guest lecturers, sharing wartime survival skills with disaster preparedness students. A Scottish tech startup pairs coding apprentices with retired shipyard engineers, merging analog ingenuity with digital tools. Even simple shifts matter. When a Utah school district moved its preschool into a senior center, both groups' health metrics improved dramatically. Children's literacy scores rose while elders required fewer pain medications. The deeper magic lies in how indigenous cultures structure this exchange. A Kung elder doesn't just dispense wisdom, she earns authority through continuous testing. Her weather predictions are verified against actual storms, her plant knowledge validated by healing outcomes. This creates what anthropologists call living libraries with quality control, systems where expertise stays relevant because it's constantly applied. Modern mentorship programs often miss this feedback loop, treating elder knowledge as artifacts rather than evolving practices. Perhaps the most poignant lesson comes from the way these societies handle cognitive decline. The Yupik of Alaska interpret dementia not as erasure, but as the mind returning to its earliest memories. Rather than isolating confused elders, they engage them in childhood tasks, peeling fish, weaving grass, triggering deep-seated motor skills that restore fleeting moments of clarity. Neurologists now recognize these reminiscence therapies as more effective than many medications at easing agitation. It's a radical act of respect, meeting the aged where they are, rather than demanding they stay where we prefer. From Bolivia's jungles to Tokyo's skyscrapers, the pattern holds true. Communities that honor wrinkles thrive, while those that exile them wither. the Tsimane remind us that aging isn't a problem to solve, but a curriculum waiting to be taught if we're wise enough to pull up chairs and listen. From sustainable living to holistic health, primitive cultures didn't just survive. They thrived by mastering something we've forgotten, the art of balance. Take the Kogi people of Colombia, who call themselves the elder brothers of humanity. For centuries, they've maintained terraced farms on steep mountain slopes, using irrigation systems that mimic natural watersheds. But here's what's extraordinary: they don't just farm the land, they talk to it. Before planting, Kogi Mamo's spiritual leaders conduct elaborate rituals to listen to the soil's needs, a practice modern agronomists now recognize as intuitive soil science. Their yields aren't just abundant, they're regenerative, leaving the earth richer with each harvest. Compare that to industrial agriculture, where depleted soils demand chemical fixes in a vicious cycle. The Kogi's secret: they never saw nature as a machine to exploit, but as a living partner in dialogue. This mindset ripples through every aspect of indigenous wisdom. Consider the Finnish concept of sisu, a blend of resilience and harmony with nature that propelled generations through harsh Arctic winters, or Japan's ancient Satoyama system, where villages managed forests, rice paddies, and grasslands as interconnected organs of a single body. These weren't romantic ideals, they were sophisticated survival strategies honed over millennia. When the Maori say, "Ko o te wenua ko o," I am the land is me, they're stating an ecological fact, one that Western science now confirms through studies on microbiomes and interconnected root systems. Yet the most urgent lesson lies in how these cultures define progress. For the Inuit, advancement wasn't about conquering nature, but refining their ability to read its subtle cues. A master hunter could interpret the faintest crack in sea ice or the direction a snowflake drifted, skills that meant life or death. Modern climate scientists now rely on similar indigenous knowledge to track Arctic melting, proving that primitive expertise often outpaces satellite data. The irony is crushing. The very societies that industrialized nations once dismissed now hold the keys to repairing the damage industrialization caused. But here's the hopeful part: this wisdom isn't lost. From architects designing buildings inspired by termite mounds, passive cooling, to doctors prescribing forest bathing for stress relief, fragments of ancient insight are resurfacing. In Brazil's Amazon, the Yawanawa tribe partners with cosmetic companies to harvest urucum sustainably, proving that economic growth and ecological stewardship can coexist. In Norway, seed vaults preserve crop varieties first cultivated by indigenous farmers, acknowledging their irreplaceable role in food security. Each example whispers the same truth: the future doesn't demand new inventions, but the humility to relearn what we once knew. So where do we begin? Start small. Plant a garden using companion techniques from Native American Three Sisters agriculture, where corn, beans, and squash grow in mutual support. Try the Pomodoro technique, modern productivity's echo of the Navajo practice of balancing work with mindful pauses. Or simply spend time observing nature's rhythms without agenda, as the San hunters do when tracking game. The goal isn't to abandon technology, but to weave ancient and modern wisdom into a stronger fabric. As you reflect on these lessons, consider this: the crises we face, climate chaos, loneliness, existential burnout, aren't just policy failures. They're the symptoms of a civilization that forgot how to listen. Indigenous cultures remind us that survival isn't about dominating the world, but conversing with it. Their legacy isn't a museum exhibit, it's an invitation to reconnect. So let's move forward by looking back, not with nostalgia, but with the clarity that the best solutions are often the ones we've carried all along. Share in the comments which insight resonated most, and subscribe to keep rediscovering how the past can light